Job today is to tell you a little bit about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And this presentation is going to be kind of just like a cursory overview of the evidence. So if you're really interested in this, you might find this more tantalizing than satisfying. And for that reason, I'm going to also tell you where you can go to find more about this stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so one way of organizing the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, the way I like to do it is to sort it into three layers. So layer one consists of some widely accepted facts that directly support the resurrection. And then layer two consists of evidence for the general trustworthiness of certain parts of the Bible that report that the resurrection took place. And then layer three is evidence for the existence of God, which turns out to be relevant to the resurrection in an indirect way that I'll explain. So I want to try to go through these three layers, but I'm going to spend basically the first half of this presentation on layer one and the second half on layer two, and I'm not really going to spend any time at all on layer three. I'll say just something very short about it because it's the least directly relevant. Okay, so first of all, then layer one. There are a few widely accepted historical facts that are often cited as evidence for the resurrection. The list of facts varies from person to person, and they can be carved up differently, but I'm going to give you 10 facts that are widely accepted and that are direct evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. What do I mean by those facts being widely accepted? What I mean is that they are accepted by a majority of the relevant experts, where the relevant experts are going to be people like historians and biblical scholars who work on this subject. And that's regardless of their religious views. So that's what I mean by widely accepted. And then as far as like, what do I mean by they support the resurrection? Well, you can think about it like this. The hypothesis that Jesus really did rise from the dead explains the following 10 facts very nicely. And it turns out that it's pretty difficult to explain them collectively in any other way. Collectively, not necessarily individually. Some of them individually are easy to explain in other ways. All right, but anyway, here we go. 10 facts. Number one. There was a historical person named Jesus of Nazareth who enjoyed a striking religious reputation as a prophet, a miracle worker, and a good person. Okay, what does that have to do with the resurrection? Well, basically, it makes Jesus look like the kind of person that you might expect to be resurrected. So the thought here is like, look, if it turns out that there is a God and that God might be interested in resurrecting somebody, Jesus looks like a better candidate than just some random dude. And so there's a certain extent to which this basic fact about Jesus and kind of what he was like at least increases the plausibility of the reports that he was resurrected to some degree. Fact number two, Jesus was crucified by the Romans for sedition and was buried in a tomb, likely the tomb that is now under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This fact is mostly important because it rules out some alternative explanations of the next few facts that I'm going to go through. Fact number three, the tomb was found empty a couple of days after Jesus was interred. This is probably the most controversial fact on the list, but it is, I have reason to believe, still the majority view among the relevant experts, and that's for good reason, because there is actually a lot of evidence for this. Also, though, I think it's important to realize that this fact isn't really as significant as it might seem. Much more important is, I think, fact number four. The early Christians had experiences that they believed were experiences of the risen Jesus appearing to them. This fact is pretty much universally accepted among the relevant scholars, and this one is, it really narrows down the explanatory options quite a bit. There are not a lot of ways to explain this other than resurrection. Okay, so this is an important fact, and it's extremely widely accepted. Fact number five, at least two adversaries of Jesus' movement, James and Paul, converted to Christianity. In the case of Paul, we know that it was because of one of those experiences which Paul took to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. In the case of James, we have reason to suspect that it was, but we don't know for sure. Fact number 6, Jesus' disciples were transformed from cowardliness to boldness shortly after Jesus was crucified. So there was this transformation in their personality that needs to be explained somehow. Fact number 7 is related. The early Christians dramatically changed their beliefs and practices, and this in a number of different ways. So one thing is they adopted a non-standard view about the resurrection. So in first century Jewish Palestine, among the people who believed in resurrection, the standard view was that everybody would be raised from the dead at the end of the world for a final judgment. But what the Christians suddenly started to say shortly after Jesus died was that one resurrection had happened early, that there was this special exception in the case of Jesus for special reasons. And so this was a modification of the standard view in their milieu. They also adopted a non-standard view about the Messiah. All right, the standard view of the Messiah at that time was that the Messiah would be a military figure who would come and overthrow Rome and liberate the Jews from their Roman oppressors. But of course, that's not at all what Jesus did. Quite the contrary, the Romans actually executed Jesus at the demand of the Jews who the Messiah was supposed to come to save. And moreover, Jesus, the crucifixion was like the most shameful way to die. And in fact, the Jews in the first century usually took crucifixion to mean that the victim was cursed by God on the basis of a passage in Deuteronomy that they interpreted in a kind of loose way. So anyway, when the Christians started to say after Jesus had been crucified by the Romans that he was the Messiah, this was a sort of radically different view of what the Messiah was like than they would have been raised with and then what was going on around them. They also adopted a non-standard view about Gentiles. All right, the standard Jewish view was only Jews are going to be saved by Yahweh. But the Christians started to say, no, Gentiles can be saved too if they believe in Jesus. And then they adopted Sunday as a new day of worship, which is hugely significant because for centuries, for Jews, the holy day was Saturday, the Sabbath. But all of a sudden, the Christians started to treat Sunday as a holy day as well. And of course, that's significant in part because traditionally that's the day that the resurrection occurred, the tomb was found empty, and so forth. All of these are ways in which the beliefs and practices of the early Christians suddenly took this weird right turn after Jesus died. And that's something that needs to be explained, but it's not just that we need to explain why they had this shift in their beliefs and practices. It's important to see that one thing that this fact really brings out is that what they started to proclaim when they started to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus went against the grain of the religious and cultural context that they were in. So what they were saying isn't something that would naturally be supported or accepted in that context. It's rather something that clashed radically with the context that they were in. And yet the message that they proclaimed ended up spreading quite successfully. Okay, fact number 8, the resurrection was proclaimed by the witnesses in spite of persecution. Okay, so it's not just that they were claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. These claims were put under pressure because the people making them were persecuted, and in some cases to the point of martyrdom. And yet, as far as we know, none of them ever recanted. Similarly, fact number 9, the resurrection was proclaimed in Jerusalem where it would be easiest to falsify. All right, so this happened in a context where the claims that were being made could have been put under another kind of pressure from critical scrutiny, because they're in Jerusalem, which means that the place where they're making these claims is the place where people saw Jesus crucified, saw him buried. They're right down the road from wherever Jesus was interred, so that one could presumably go check the tomb and see whether it was empty or not. And the witnesses were all around. They were local, so that they could potentially be questioned or interrogated. And so this took, it wasn't like, the disciples went to India and said, oh, well, let's tell you about this crazy thing that happened in this faraway land, right? So it was at ground zero where they were making these claims. Okay, and then fact number 10, Christianity grew rapidly shortly after Jesus' death. So in the first century, normally what would happen when a messianic movement started up, and then the leader was killed, is once the leader died, the movement would fizzle out. It would just dissolve. But in this weird anomalous case, when the Jesus movement, gained traction and then Jesus was killed, what happened next after a short pause was that the movement exploded. And it grew much more rapidly than it did during Jesus' own lifetime. And over the course of the next few centuries, it actually ended up taking over the Roman Empire in a peaceful, nonviolent way. Okay, so those are 10 facts that are widely accepted by relevant experts and that seem to support the resurrection. Certainly taken as a group, it's hard to explain them in another way other than appealing to the resurrection. If you want to know more about those facts, here are some places you can go. There's a book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. Both of those guys have done a lot of work on the historical argument for the resurrection. So they wrote that book together a while back, and it's aimed at like just ordinary people. It's meant to be a not too technical kind of a book. Similarly, a much older book, A View of the Evidences of Christianity. This book is old enough now that it's in the public domain. It was written by a 19th century author, an influential 19th century Christian apologist named William Paley. It's a very good book. There's a video called A Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by The Analytic Christian, which is a YouTube channel. Now, there's a lot of junk on YouTube. And if you go looking for stuff about this on YouTube, you're going to probably run into a lot of junk. But in this case, I can assure you that this isn't junk. So The Analytic Christian is a channel. It's the guy who runs it is like a high school science teacher. But what he does is he interviews scholars, and he's focused on communicating the work of Christian scholars to ordinary people. And there's a team of scholars who actually filter the material that shows up on his channel and kind of advise him on what to share and what not share and so forth, so that there's quality control there. I know this because I'm one of the people who does the filtering. So I can assure you that that is actually a really good source. Also, there is a podcast called Capturing Christianity, and they have a 5-part series of episodes called The Historical Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, which is also really well done and a good source. Okay, so that was layer 1. Here's layer 2. Evidence for the general trustworthiness of the Gospels and Acts. The Gospels and Acts, what the heck is that? Let me just make sure we're all on the same page here. Many of you probably already know what the Gospels and Acts are, but just in case, I want to make sure. All right, so the Gospels and Acts are part of the Bible, and more specifically, part of the New Testament. But importantly, they were originally written as separate documents in separate contexts. The Gospels are each biographies of Jesus written by different people, and Acts is a history of the early church, of like what happened in the early Christianity right after Jesus reportedly was resurrected. Acts was actually written as a sequel to one of the Gospels. And this is important because it means, these documents were only later collected together and included in the Bible. So originally, they're just ordinary historical primary sources, the kind of sources we use to know anything at all about ancient history. And that raises the following question. Are these trustworthy historical sources? Are they accurate? Can we count on them to be giving us the truth about what actually happened in the ancient world? I'm going to argue that yes, we can. And the fact that they are trustworthy, I think, turns out to be evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Let me first explain why that's so. All right, so just suppose for a minute that the Gospels and Acts are historically accurate documents. How would that support the resurrection? Well, at least in 3 ways. First of all, the more trustworthy we take the authors of those documents to be, the more accurate we think they are, the more reason we have to believe them when they make the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, and they do make that claim. Okay, so that's sort of a straightforward reason. But also, the more we think that those documents are historically trustworthy, even on details, the more and more details about the resurrection appearances and the empty tomb and things like that we're going to have to take as data to be explained rather than dismissing it as legend. And it turns out the more of those details you add, the harder it is to explain away the appearances as something other than genuine appearances of the resurrected Jesus. When you start adding in details about like, okay, where did these appearances occur? Who was there? What was said? What did they do? Okay, and then also, you know, as we, if we take the Gospels and Acts to be historically trustworthy, you know, throughout, then we're also going to get a whole lot more detail about who Jesus was, what he taught, what exactly happened in the early church downstream of the resurrection reports. And I think that a lot of those details, as they're added into the story, tend to increase further the plausibility that, like, okay, Jesus seems like a good candidate for crucifixion, and the things that happened in the church following the reported resurrection are the kind of things you would expect to happen following such an event, and so forth. Okay, so these are all reasons why, if it turned out that the Gospels and Acts are generally historically accurate, trustworthy documents, that would support the resurrection. Are they historically trustworthy documents? Well, here's a reason to think so. I think there's a great deal of evidence in their favor. And what I want to do is give you 7 different kinds of evidence supporting the general trustworthiness of the Gospels and Acts. There's too much evidence to just go through examples, but I'm going to give you 7 different sort of categories into which that evidence falls. All right, so number 1, many details in the Gospels and Acts are confirmed by external sources such as archaeology. Okay, so the Gospels and Acts will mention various towns and cities, and they'll say things that imply, you know, differences in elevation between them, and they'll talk about like how, okay, there's a temple here and it has a gate on this side and a different gate on this other side, and there's a pool that's like over here, and archaeologists are able to go and confirm these sorts of claims and dig up the places that the New Testament mentions and find them where the New Testament says that they are to be found. So many of the details are confirmed by archaeology. Many details in the Gospels and Acts are also directly reported by multiple independent sources. So if a newspaper reports that a certain thing happened, that's some reason to think that it did happen. If a second newspaper reports the same thing, and it does so independently, like it didn't just copy from the first newspaper, for example, now you've got even more reason to think that that one thing happened. Well, that kind of multiple attestation, as it's called, is actually available for a lot of the facts that are reported in the Gospels and Acts. In some cases, outside sources, non-Christian ancient historians report or confirm some of the details that are reported in the Gospels and Acts. But you also get multiple independent attestation within the New Testament itself. And that's because, remember, the documents in the New Testament were originally written as separate documents in separate contexts for different purposes, and only later collected into the Bible. And so some of them, not all of them, but some of them are actually independent or use independent sources at various points. And in some of those cases where they are relying on independent sources, those independent sources agree on various points. And so you have multiple attestation to the points on which they, you know, say the same things. Number 3, this one is similar, it's related to number 2. Many details instantiate themes and patterns that span multiple independent sources. Okay, so this is like multiple attestation, but it's a little bit more subtle, because instead of independent sources both like explicitly reporting the same detail, what you get is independent sources fitting together into a kind of pattern. So for example, you will get like Jesus' teaching style, it seems the same across independent sources, or the themes that he teaches about seem the same across independent sources, or Peter's personality seems the same across independent sources. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4, many details across the New Testament explain each other in very subtle ways that look unplanned. These are called undesigned coincidences. And here's what this looks like. So it would be like, for example, in one gospel, you get like some little detail that just sort of is mentioned in passing. And then in another gospel, you get a different detail that's just sort of mentioned in passing. And it turns out that the one detail in the one gospel explains the other detail in the other gospel. And what you get then is what's sometimes described as a kind of interlocking between these two gospels, or whatever the documents are, interlocking that looks unplanned. It doesn't look like it was contrived. It looks like it just sort of happened on its own. And the argument is that, well, usually the best explanation for this is that the documents are just reporting what actually happened, because we expect the truth to just kind of fit together all on its own without anybody having to make sure that it fits. Okay. Number 5, many details would not likely have been invented by the New Testament authors because they were embarrassing. All right, this is really important. So there are lots of details in the Gospels and Acts that are at least potentially embarrassing for the Christians, because, for example, they take people who are really important to the Christians and who are a big deal in the early church and make them look bad. All right, so there are lots of places in the Gospels where the disciples, or Jesus' disciples, who became the apostles, were where they just like don't understand what Jesus is teaching, or they say stupid things, or they do stupid things. And you just get this all the way through the Gospels. And also there are things that make Jesus look bad, or would have made him look bad in that context. So the fact that he was betrayed by a member of his inner circle, the fact that he was crucified, this really shameful form of capital punishment, and so forth. So there are a lot of these details in the Gospels and Acts that the fact that they're reported at all makes it seem like the authors of these documents are really candid and honest. All right, they're not, trying to gloss over these things or leave things out. They're really honest, doing honest historical work. Okay, fact number 6, many details in the Gospels and Acts are very restrained and unembellished. Okay, so one case that you see this is with miracle stories. It would be very easy to embellish a lot of the miracle stories that you see in the Gospels and Acts to make the miracle even more amazing, or have even more witnesses, or more important witnesses, or whatever. All right, and actually, I know of at least one case. There are probably a lot more, but I know of at least one case of a later like pseudo gospel that does this with the resurrection. But what you see in the New Testament actually is not so much not embellishment, but really more often restraint. Things being left sometimes a little bit ambiguous or less amazing than they could have been, and so forth. And again, that suggests that we're dealing with careful and sort of scrupulous historians here as authors of these documents. Okay, and then finally, number 7, many details in the Gospels and Acts serve no clear literary or theological purpose. So I'm thinking here of details like this. So like, that it was so-and-so, such minor character who's never mentioned again, that answered the door when Peter came knocking. Or that, we took a sounding and the water was precisely this deep as we approached the island of Malta. You get these random little details that it just doesn't seem like the kind of thing you would put in a piece of theological propaganda, because it doesn't really do anything theologically. But it is the sort of thing that you might put in a history if what you're doing is just sort of recounting what happened, because it might very well be that is what happened, and so that's why you write it down. Also, in some cases, these sort of theologically pointless, you might say, details, sometimes they're sort of odd and they raise obvious questions, and those questions are left unanswered. So like there's this weird detail about a guy who runs away naked when Jesus is arrested in the Gospel of Mark. And people have speculated for centuries, like, what the heck is that about? And no one knows. I mean, there are a bunch of theories, but and what's interesting is that, look, if you're just writing fiction, you're not super likely, at least in most contexts, to leave these like dangling loose ends like that. But if you're just recording what happened, and that happened, then you might write it down, whether or not you know what the heck was going on there. Okay, so that's the 7th kind of evidence. All right, where am I? Okay, good. So if you want more information about that kind of stuff, there's a book called Hidden in Plain View by Liddy McGrew, specifically about undesigned coincidences. That's a great book, not technical at all, very readable. Another book, Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter Williams. That one will cover a wider range of the kinds of evidence that I was just looking at, not just the undesigned coincidences. There's a big fat book by Craig Blomberg called The Historical Reliability of the New Testament. It's at least trying to be on the accessible, non-technical side. It's a little bit less successful at that than some of these other books, but it does have some success in that regard. And then Tim McGrew has a series of lectures on the historical reliability of the Gospels that's published on YouTube by Apologetics 315, and that particular series is very good. I recommend it. Okay. And then finally, layer 3, evidence for the existence of God. And here I'm not going to say much at all because this just raises too many other issues that are not super, they're only indirectly relevant. So all I want to do here is just say that the more reason we have to think that God exists, the more plausible it is that miracles might happen sometimes because there's actually a being out there that's capable of performing them and might have reasons to do so. And therefore, the more plausible it is that the resurrection of Jesus has occurred. And so evidence for the existence of God is at least indirectly relevant to the resurrection. And there are lots of arguments for the existence of God that philosophers have developed over the years and continue to develop. There are arguments for God from the existence of the universe, from the appearance of design in nature, from certain facts about morality, from certain facts about minds and consciousness, and then from the fundamental metaphysical structure of reality. But I'm not going to go into all that now. So if you want more information about that, since I'm not giving it to you, one place you can go is a book called How Reason Can Lead to God by Josh Rasmussen. Josh Rasmussen is a really sharp philosopher, and that book is written for ordinary people, not for professional philosophers, and he did a great job with it. Another book, similarly, Taking Pascal's Wager by a philosopher named Mike Roda. This is another book that's written for ordinary people, but it's covers a lot of the standard arguments for the existence of God, and it does a good job. And this is, I think, really cool. That YouTube channel I mentioned, The Analytic Christian, actually has created a series of animated videos that summarize Rhoda's book chapter by chapter, and it's really well done, so I recommend that. And then Capturing Christianity, they recently did a video. It was actually a 4-hour live stream that you can find on YouTube, where he brought on a philosopher, and the philosopher went through kind of rapid fire about 150 different arguments for the existence of God that have been defended in the academic literature, and just said, okay, here's basically how the argument goes. Here's where you can go to find all the details, and gives like a citation or two. So that's another thing that you could check out. And that's what I've got. So I hope that that was at least somewhat interesting, somewhat helpful, or something along those lines.